Route 44A, Phuoc. Long, July 1968. 3 weeks of early season rain had turned the road into a strip of clay and crushed bamboo. American troops called it a mud trap, but anyone with experience knew it was a deliberate setup, precise enough for a single B-40 to finish off an M113. People said the mud killed them. In reality, the mud was just stage dressing. What truly killed was the planning the men who measured distances, timed everything, and shaped every meter of road to turn an M113 into a steel coffin. In 3 weeks, 5 convoys had been lost in the exact same pattern. Tomorrow, unless something changed, another name would be added to the casualty board. Inside the maintenance shed, Technical Sergeant Frank Mallory stood in front of an M113 hull cut clean in half. The floor ripped open classic signatures of a directional charge. He picked up a bent piece of steel, turned it in his hand without a word. Lieutenant Walker stepped in uniform, streaked with mud. Another one. Same setup. Speed dropped to 4 miles an hour going into the pit. That's slow and it's basically suicide. Walker set the report folder down. 5 convoys in 3 weeks. If we don't come up with something by tomorrow, the next supply run is going to take losses. Mallory flipped back to an old page in his notebook, the one with a line heavily underlined. Outside, the troops worked in near silence, stringing nets, changing air filters, tightening tracks, everyone sensing something was shifting. Pierce had suggested delaying the convoy 48 hours. The division rejected it. Walker looked at Mallory Frank. "You're the only one who can pull this off." Mallory shook his head. Supplies were scarce, only scrap metal left in the yard. Time wasn't waiting, the convoy would roll at dawn. He buckled his tool pouch, stepped outside. Rows of M113s sat along the lot, tracks caked with mud up to the hull. The race had already started. The enemy was 3 steps ahead. Mallory needed to find the 4th, or there'd be another name on the wooden board by morning. The next morning, a 3-vehicle convoy left the base to test Pierce's temporary fixed dump rocks into the mud pit, keep the throttle high, and run in a tight column to reduce stop time. No one believed it would work, but headquarters wanted a report by the end of the day. Mallory rode in the 2nd vehicle, noting every change in the road surface. Inside the compartment, the smell of burnt oil mixed with old gunpowder hung thick in the air, catching in their throats. The M113's engine stumbled every few seconds, the motor roaring to keep its RPM up after 3 straight weeks of running in the rain. Loose track bolts clacked, clack, clack. Every time the vehicle jolted a sound that made everyone feel like the whole machine could snap in half at any moment. When they reached the area where the deep mud pit had been, the lead track roared forward trying to push through. Then the nose dipped. The front track sank halfway up the hull, the engine screaming without gaining an inch. Mud poured over the belly pan, the tracks just spinning. A low flash at ground level. A directional charge. The blast lifted the lead vehicle's compartment clean off the ground, tearing through the armor. 2 crewmen were gone instantly. As the convoy tried to maneuver out a low-set fighting position on the left, opened fire. A B-40 shot skimmed past the rear of Mallory's vehicle, sending dirt and bamboo splinters into the compartment. The firing angle was so low, the entire underside of the vehicle was exposed. Rifles cracked through the tree line. Secondary pits and firing holes appeared as the soil collapsed. Walker ordered a 200-meter withdrawal. The 3rd vehicle dropped smoke to cover the retreat. By the time they broke contact, 3 men were wounded and 2 vehicles were nearly out of action, all in under 2 minutes. Mallory glanced at the speed gauge. The needle was pinned at 3 and wouldn't climb. He knew every second the vehicle stayed stuck meant another weapon lining up on them. A B-40 could be reloaded in under 6 seconds. A scout on the other side needed only a few steps to get within firing distance. If the convoy stayed still for even 5 more seconds, they'd be torn apart right there in the mud. This wasn't an accident. This was how the site had been built. The mud pit was shaped to force a vehicle to stop for a few seconds. The firing positions were set low to hit the troop compartment. The directional charge waited for the exact moment the vehicle lost speed. They understood the weak spots and struck right at them. From this point on, it was a race. Whoever adapted faster would survive. Mallory watched the damaged M113 being hauled back, mud caked over the suspension. He didn't need anyone to explain. Once a vehicle stopped, the crew was as good as done. The rock dump idea was useless. This mud had been engineered to trap and kill. He opened his notebook and wrote one short line. To stay alive, the vehicle has to keep moving. Walker reported the casualty to Parker, 22 years old, gone after just 2 weeks in country. A larger convoy was scheduled to roll in 48 hours, and postponement wasn't an option. The night before the convoy was set to roll out, the repair shed felt suffocatingly quiet. No one could sleep. The humidity soaked through their cots, the smell of diesel hung heavy in the air, and the cooling metal from the cut-open M113 echoed in slow, steady clicks. A few soldiers sat under the dim yellow lights, carving the names of the men they'd just lost into the side of the vehicle. Not for decoration, but as a reminder that they had to stay alive. Come morning. Across the line, High Lewis scout team curled up in a dirt bunker, holding position for 2 straight days, just to catch the exact moment the convoy would enter their zone. Others sat motionless for hours in the dark, listening for the sound of engines and track links, learning to recognize each type of vehicle by noise alone. They prepared for the next ambush with the same ruthless patience as the jungle around them. When Mallory asked what materials they had left to work with, the answer was blunt scrap. The only usable hydraulics were from an old broken crane out in the yard. No straight steel remained, just curved plates salvaged from last week's destroyed vehicle. Everything was worn out, improvised, or too old. Mallory looked back toward the road where they'd just been hit. The mud pit was still there. The firing positions were still there. Tomorrow, the situation would be even worse. There's no perfect fix, he said. But if we move fast, it'll be enough to keep people alive. Walker nodded. Mallory asked for one night and a 6-man team. They gave him both. Countermeasure, Phase 1. Start. Repair Shed Number 2, Phuoc Long Base. The rain had just stopped, leaving the ground soft like porridge. Mallory spread an oil-stained schematic across a wooden crate and looked at the 6 men on his team: mechanics, welders, electricians, men who had survived the morning's ambush and were now about to work straight through the next 20 hours. He didn't waste time. He told them plainly they were short on equipment and the only materials left were scraps. But tomorrow's convoy still had to move. If they couldn't build something tonight, the casualties would repeat. By the next morning, they tested all 3 improvised solutions at once in a makeshift trial pit. The screwjack rig lifted the vehicle out of shallow mud, giving the tracks enough grip to move again. Low acceleration, but stable. The angled blast shield held against a 5-kilogram test charge. The welds shook but didn't fail, and no fragments punched through. The lowered gun mount swept out low-set fighting positions in seconds. The drawbacks showed up immediately during the test run. The vehicle was heavier, nearly 20% slower, and the frame shook badly if fired on the move. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than letting a vehicle die in place on Route 44A. Mallory assigned tasks. Ramirez took the angled frame welding. Dunn handled the hydraulics. Owens cut steel. The others stripped down M113 number 27, the only one still running. By mid-afternoon, the shed was scorching from welding arcs, hammer strikes, the smell of burning metal, and old oil. The smell of burnt grease rose from the cylinder block Dunn had just pulled apart. Ramirez welded so long, the sparks scorched his sleeve, leaving a blackened patch. But he just brushed it off and kept working. Owens sawed through a piece of steel, the worn-out blade screeching close to snapping, and no one had a spare. Dunn tore open the crane's hydraulic unit, rusted cylinders, cracked lines. Mallory bent over it, scraping rust, replacing seals, wrapping new connections. Ramirez's first weld sparked and blew brittle metal that had to be cut off. Owens tightened cables for the gun mount, his hands still shaking from the morning's attack. Around 4 p.m., Second Lieutenant Pierce walked in. His uniform was still clean, nameplate polished. His eyes swept over the stripped M113 and the rough steel frame taking shape. He said only one thing: they were violating maintenance procedure and using uncertified materials. Mallory answered simply, "The vehicle will end up like the one this morning if we don't do this." Walker stepped in right after shutting down the argument. Pierce left, and the room felt as tight as heated steel. The team kept working through the night. Every weld was hammer tested, every cable tightened by hand. Mallory tested the screwjack system. The cylinder groaned, but the hull lifted. The angled frame was secured with 8 bolts pulled from an ammunition pallet. The lowered gun mount locked into place, brushing the armor plate. 1:27 a.m. Countermeasure. Phase 1 structure complete. Less than 8 hours remained until dawn. And they still had to test the whole thing at least once. On the open ground east of Phuoc Long Base, the sun had just risen and moisture was still lifting off the soil. Dunn and Owens had spent the entire night digging a test mud pit. The mud wasn't as deep as on Route 44A, but it was enough to test the screwjack system. The vehicle drove into the pit, the track sinking almost halfway up the hull. Mallory gave the signal. The two screwjacks dropped bit into the ground and lifted the hull a few centimeters. The tracks immediately regained grip, and the M113 crawled out of the mud as if slipping free from a trap. Note screwjack system works low acceleration but stable. Next came the blast test. They buried a 5-kilogram directional charge and backed the vehicle into position. The explosion shook the ground. The angled frame glowed red, a few welds quivering hard but not failing. No penetration, no deformation inside the compartment. Note, angled frame holds welds shake but don't break. Finally, they tested the lowered gun mount. Owens squeezed the trigger on the M60, the burst sweeping along the ground and tearing through the mock low-set fighting position in seconds. Note, gun mount meets requirement, but the drawbacks appeared immediately during the full run. The added weight slowed the vehicle by nearly 20%, and the engine had to roar just to keep speed. The frame shook violently and risked misalignment if fired while moving. Pierce showed up for a quick look, noted the technical risks, and recommended stopping the project. But the convoy still had to depart, and no one had any other options. Mallory sat on the hull, sweat running down his face. He reviewed the 3 items in his notebook. Screwjack system, effective but heavy. Angled frame, blast resistant but shakes. Lowered gun mount, accurate but hard to fire on the move. None of it was perfect, but every piece was better than letting a convoy die in the mud like the day before. Walker stood beside him and said only one thing they needed this vehicle to survive, Route 44A. Mallory closed the notebook and confirmed it. The vehicle would roll out at 0600 the next morning. By late afternoon, the whole base was preparing for the convoy ammunition, radios, water cans, tie-downs. Among the line of M113s stained with mud and burn marks, Mallory's vehicle stood out with its rough screwjack assembly, the welded curved steel frame, and the improvised gun mount. It looked like a rushed repair job. But for the men who had to face Route 44A, it was their only real chance. Walker placed a hand on the vehicle's side and said, "If it runs the way it did this morning, it's going to save a lot of people." Mallory touched the screwjack housing, feeling the cold metal, and waited for sunrise. Route 44A, 1620. Late afternoon light filtered through the trees, casting a dull yellow over the road. The 11-vehicle convoy cleared a patch of thin forest and entered the designated high-risk zone. Mallory sat inside the compartment, hand resting on the screwjack switch. Walker stood by the radio, watching every meter of road. The ground in front of the lead vehicle dipped slightly, just a small shift, but one Mallory had learned to recognize after 3 months of dealing with mud traps. Seconds later, the layer of clay and crushed bamboo collapsed. The first vehicle nosed down, and half the hull sank. The driver gunned the engine to no effect. The screwjack system engaged. 2 jacks dropped bit into the earth hydraulics, screeching as they lifted the hull a few centimeters. Just as in the trial, 15 seconds later, the lead vehicle pulled itself free of the pit. Almost instantly, a low flash on the left signaled a directional charge. The blast swept across the road, struck the hull, and flared off to both sides, thanks to the new angled frame. The armor dented deeply, the steel discolored, but the crew compartment held no penetration. From the base of a nearby cashew tree where a low fighting position had been dug, barely level with half a road wheel, a B-40 round shot out. Owens lowered the M60's angle, the burst cutting across the ground and clearing the position in seconds. Sandbags burst apart. 2 figures vanished into the secondary pit behind it. Dunn kept the throttle high. The convoy tightened formation, holding 6 miles an hour. Inside the compartment, the men were pressed back into the steel seats, gripping their straps, as every jolt dragged 10 to 12 kilos of mud on their boots like dead weight. One of them tried breathing through his mouth, the burnt electrical smell from the previous hit, still leaking out of the control panel. Bursts of AK fire swept across the roof, each round smacking against the hot armor like a hammer hitting a steel pan. Bursts from the tree line skittered off the roofs. No vehicle was pinned down the way they had been before. In less than 2 minutes, they cleared the entire ambush zone rather than being trapped for 6 minutes as they were 3 weeks earlier. At the first safe stretch, the whole crew fell silent. Dunn let go of the throttle lever, his hand still locked in the same tight grip he'd held at full power. Owens leaned back against the steel wall, breathing in short bursts, his ears still ringing from the blast. A young crewman stared at his mud-covered gloves, suddenly noticing they had torn at some point, without him realizing it. For a few seconds, none of them moved, as if their bodies hadn't caught up to the fact that they had just survived one more round. The difference was simple: the convoy was still moving. Once they kept their momentum, the mud trap lost its purpose. Both the directional charges and the low-set positions had been designed to hit a vehicle that was stopped, not one pushing through without pause. 200 meters ahead in a safe stretch, they halted for a quick check. The screw jacks were glowing hot but intact, the angled frame dented but unbroken. The gun mount still held its set angle. No casualties, just a few scrape marks from the shaking. The lead driver summed it up. If we'd been 5 seconds slower, that B-40 would have hit us. Countermeasure 1, effective. Now we wait for their next move. Walker said, exhaling for the first time in weeks. Mallory's answer was flat. They had won one round and the other side would adjust. At the edge of the tree line, a scout who had watched the whole fight scribbled a note: screwjack system, blast deflection frame, lower firing angle, must change tactic. Evening settled in. Smoke and damp earth still carried a warm smell from the explosions. In a lookout hut north of Route 44A, Ledouis, Ty, the man who had laid the mud traps for 3 weeks, studied the marks left behind the churn pit, the soil pushed up in long ridges by the screwjacks. His conclusion was simple: the trap had failed. 2 hours later, in an underground shelter belonging to Company 307, Hai Lua and the engineer team examined the collected armor fragments, soil, and sandbag pieces. The dents showed the directional charge had been deflected. The low firing angle was neutralized. The American vehicles could escape the mud faster now. There was only one reasonable response: adjust. Hai Lua drafted the new 2-layer clamp plan. Not one mud trap, but 4 spaced 20 meters apart to force the screwjacks to run repeatedly until overloaded. Place the mine after the second pit, time for the moment the jacks were retracting. Move the firing positions up the slope to fire downward beyond the lowered gun mount's angle. At the American motor pool a few kilometers away, Mallory inspected the angled frame, listening to the tired metallic creak from the earlier blast test. Dunn asked whether the other side would back off. Mallory just shook his head. They'll improve the trap. That's what they always do. Countermeasure the enemy will adapt. Prepare Phase 2. Route 44A, the third day after the first successful run. The sky was overcast, the wind carrying moisture from the Melaleuca woods. Walker tightened the formation. Mallory sat close to the control panel, hand resting on the screwjack switch. He knew the other side wouldn't repeat their old tactics. Up ahead, thin patches of loose mud and long, shallow cuts along both sides of the road appeared signs someone had broken the surface overnight to let water soak in faster. A clear message they were preparing something new. 300 meters later, the ground gave way, revealing a familiar mud pit. The lead vehicle sank instantly. The screwjacks deployed, and the M113 crawled out of the first pit in about 16 seconds. But Mallory's attention shifted to the ground behind it. The top layer had been scraped thin, almost deliberately hinting at something hidden. As soon as the lead vehicle cleared the first trap and the jacks began retracting, the road collapsed a second time. The second pit was deeper, slicker, filled with water, stopping the vehicle at once. This was the 10-second window the other side wanted, the period when the screwjacks couldn't be deployed again. The second layer trap hit the one weakness of the screwjack system: the reset time. They had watched the convoy escape the first trap and built the new one precisely around that blind spot. A blast hit the spot where the second vehicle should have moved up in support. From the slope on the right, new firing positions opened up. The B-40 rounds no longer came in at ground level. They fell from above, striking the roof and engine deck outside the lowered M-60's firing angle. The new setup was clear, a double trap plus high-angle fire. Dunn tried to dodge the second pit, but the shoulder of the road had been carved away, creating a dangerous tilt. A burst from above ripped off part of the engine cover. The compartment shook like someone had grabbed the whole vehicle and shaken it. Mallory had no choice. He forced the screw jacks down before the hydraulics had fully recharged. The entire hull shuddered, warning lights flashing red. If the jacks snapped, the vehicle would be stuck exactly where the ambush was designed to hold it. But they didn't break. The jack bit into the pit's edge, pushing the hull sideways. Dunn immediately shifted into reverse, yanking the M113 backward out of the trap, as if someone were pulling it from behind. The force of the jack sent the top layer of soil sliding off the right-hand slope, collapsing onto the higher fighting position, and the low firing hole beneath it. The enemy's line of fire vanished completely. At the same moment, the lead vehicle, its jacks recharged, dragged itself out of the second pit. The convoy kept moving slowly, but did not stop. Gunfire from the slope faded beneath the falling soil. 3 minutes later, they cleared the ambush zone. In a safe stretch, Mallory stepped onto the ground, his hands still shaking from the jack's recoil. One jack was bent. The angled frame had a hairline crack. Several welds had been overstressed, all the cost of a single risky decision. Walker stood beside him, looking at the streak of earth that had slid down and buried the firing positions. No words were needed. He understood how early Mallory had spotted the new trap and how he'd broken it on the spot. Mallory opened his notebook and wrote 3 short lines: 2-layer mud trap, high-angle fire, countermeasure design must change.